There's a piece of advice that circulates constantly in conversations about avoidant partners. The idea that if someone can just identify and consistently play into an avoidant specific fantasy, the version of intimacy they secretly crave without ever having to risk the vulnerability real closeness requires, that avoidant partner will finally stay, finally stop pulling away, finally choose the relationship over their own defenses. This advice sounds appealing precisely because it promises control over something that has felt uncontrollable, a formula for keeping someone whose leaving has felt unpredictable and painful. What this advice consistently fails to mention is what actually happens once someone builds a relationship around sustaining another person's fantasy rather than around genuine, mutual reality, and understanding that outcome matters considerably more than understanding the fantasy itself. If the listener has encountered this specific advice, wondering whether there's some particular fantasy or role an avoidant partner secretly wants fulfilled, one that might finally produce the security and permanence that direct honesty and patience haven't managed to achieve, this exploration is going to trace what actually happens when someone attempts this strategy and why the outcome tends to look nothing like the lasting security it promises. To understand why this strategy fails so reliably, it helps to understand what fantasy actually represents for an avoidant partner in the first place. Fantasy, in this specific context, typically involves an idealized version of intimacy that requires none of the actual vulnerability real closeness demands, connection without the risk of being truly known, desire without the discomfort of sustained emotional presence, admiration without the messiness of genuine conflict or disagreement. This fantasy isn't something an avoidant partner consciously constructs and hopes someone will fulfill. It's closer to a byproduct of their own defensive structure, an imagined version of relationship that feels safe precisely because it exists at enough distance from real intimacy to avoid triggering their usual withdrawal response. This is worth naming directly because it explains why playing into this fantasy, however successfully executed, cannot actually produce the lasting security it seems to promise. The fantasy exists specifically because it avoids genuine intimacy. Building a relationship around sustaining it means building a relationship that, by its very design, never actually asks the avoidant partner to develop the capacity for real closeness that lasting partnership requires. What gets constructed instead is something considerably more fragile than genuine connection, a performance sustained by one person's continuous effort to remain exactly what the fantasy requires, rather than a mutual relationship built on both people's authentic presence. It's worth exploring what this strategy typically requires from the person attempting it, because the demands prove considerably more significant than most advice promoting this approach ever acknowledges. Sustaining someone else's fantasy requires constant self-monitoring, continuously adjusting one's own behavior, needs, and emotional expression to match whatever version of intimacy the fantasy requires, rather than expressing genuine feelings or needs that might disrupt the careful balance being maintained. This means the person attempting this strategy effectively disappears into a role, suppressing authentic reactions whenever they conflict with what the fantasy demands, gradually losing access to their own genuine emotional experience in service of maintaining someone else's comfortable illusion. There's something worth naming plainly here for anyone who has considered, even briefly, whether adopting this specific strategy might finally solve the difficulty of loving an avoidant partner. This strategy doesn't actually solve anything. It postpones the underlying problem while extracting a significant ongoing cost from the person doing the postponing. The avoidant partner's genuine capacity for intimacy remains exactly as limited as it was before, simply less visible because the relationship has been carefully constructed to never test that capacity directly. Meanwhile, the person maintaining the fantasy gradually loses touch with their own authentic needs, becoming increasingly skilled at performance and increasingly distant from genuine self-expression, a trade that rarely feels worthwhile once its full cost becomes clear. It's worth examining what tends to happen once this fantasy-sustaining performance inevitably begins to crack, because it always eventually does, regardless of how skillfully it's initially executed. Real life doesn't accommodate sustained performance indefinitely. Illness happens, career setbacks happen, grief happens. Ordinary human need for genuine support and vulnerability eventually surfaces, and when it does, it disrupts the careful fantasy that had previously been maintained, forcing a confrontation between the relationship's constructed illusion and the reality of two actual people with genuine needs, limitations, and imperfections. This confrontation typically produces exactly the outcome the entire strategy was designed to prevent. The avoidant partner encountering real vulnerability, real need, real imperfection, and responding with the same withdrawal that genuine intimacy has always triggered in them, regardless of how successfully the fantasy postponed this reckoning. There's a particular irony worth naming here about why this specific strategy so often produces the exact outcome it was meant to avoid. Sustained fantasy requires the person maintaining it to become increasingly disconnected from their own authentic self over time, and this disconnection, ironically, often produces exactly the kind of instability and resentment that eventually destabilizes the relationship far more thoroughly than genuine, honest imperfection ever would have. Suppressed needs don't simply disappear. They accumulate, often surfacing eventually as resentment, exhaustion, or a kind of quiet despair that becomes increasingly difficult to hide, regardless of how committed someone remains to the original performance. It's worth exploring what genuine, sustainable intimacy actually requires instead, because understanding the alternative helps clarify why this fantasy-based approach represents such a significant detour from what actually works. Genuine intimacy requires both people's authentic presence, including the discomfort, disagreement, and vulnerability that authentic presence inevitably produces. This doesn't mean relationships with avoidant partners require constant intensity or confrontation. It means the relationship needs to make room for genuine imperfection, genuine need, and genuine difficulty, rather than being structured specifically to avoid these things in service of maintaining a comfortable illusion. There's something worth naming about why this fantasy-sustaining approach appeals so strongly, despite its ultimate ineffectiveness, because understanding this appeal helps explain why the advice continues circulating despite consistently failing to produce lasting results. This approach offers something genuinely seductive, a sense of control over an otherwise unpredictable dynamic. A formula that feels actionable and specific rather than the more uncertain, patience-dependent work genuine relationship building actually requires. This appeal is understandable, particularly for anyone who has felt powerless watching an avoidant partner's withdrawal, desperate for something concrete to do rather than simply waiting and hoping for change that may or may not eventually arrive. But this appeal doesn't change the underlying reality that control achieved through sustained performance isn't the same as genuine security, and the difference between these two things tends to become painfully clear once the performance inevitably falters. It's worth examining, too, how this strategy affects the person's own sense of identity over an extended timeline, because the costs described throughout this exploration compound considerably the longer the performance continues. Someone who has spent years carefully managing their own emotional expression to fit another person's fantasy often struggles, once that relationship eventually ends or transforms, to reconnect with their own authentic preferences, needs, and emotional patterns, having spent so long suppressing them in service of maintaining someone else's comfort. This represents a significant, often underestimated cost of this strategy, extending well beyond the specific relationship it was employed within, into the person's broader capacity for authentic self-expression across every future relationship they eventually build. There's a specific dimension worth exploring here concerning how this fantasy typically gets constructed in the first place, because understanding its origins clarifies why it proves so difficult to sustain over any meaningful length of time. The fantasy an avoidant partner unconsciously gravitates toward usually forms in response to whatever specific type of closeness felt most threatening during their earlier developmental years, meaning it varies considerably from one avoidant person to the next rather than following a single universal template. Some avoidants unconsciously crave a partner who remains perpetually independent and undemanding, requiring minimal emotional labor while still providing companionship and physical affection on the avoidant's own terms. Others crave something closer to idealization, a partner who consistently reflects back an inflated, flattering image without ever introducing the friction of honest feedback or disagreement. Still others gravitate toward a fantasy built around excitement and novelty, a partner who never quite settles into the predictable rhythms that long-term intimacy naturally develops, keeping the relationship perpetually feeling fresh and low stakes rather than deeply, vulnerably established. It's worth examining what identifying and adapting to this specific variant actually requires from the person attempting it, because the demands differ somewhat depending on which particular fantasy is being sustained, though the underlying cost remains remarkably consistent across all variants. Someone attempting to fulfill the independent, undemanding fantasy must continuously suppress genuine needs for reassurance, support, or shared vulnerability, presenting a curated image of self-sufficiency regardless of what's actually happening internally. Someone attempting to fulfill the idealization fantasy must suppress honest feedback and authentic disagreement, softening or eliminating anything that might puncture the avoidant partner's preferred, flattering self-image. Someone attempting to sustain the novelty fantasy must continuously generate new experiences and maintain an artificial sense of unpredictability, avoiding the natural settling that authentic long-term intimacy typically produces. In every variant, the common thread remains the same. Authentic self-expression gets systematically subordinated to whatever specific illusion the avoidant partner's defenses require in order to feel safe. There's something worth naming about how this entire dynamic connects to broader patterns of codependency, because the fantasy-sustaining strategy being examined throughout this exploration represents, in many ways, a particularly sophisticated variant of codependent behavior, even when it doesn't initially present itself using that specific language. Codependency typically involves organizing one's own identity, needs, and emotional regulation around managing another person's comfort or behavior. And sustaining an avoidant partner's fantasy does exactly this, just through a more elaborate, deliberately constructed mechanism than codependency's more familiar forms. Recognizing this connection matters because it opens access to a broader body of understanding about why codependent patterns, regardless of their specific manifestation, tend to produce similar long-term costs: gradual loss of authentic self, resentment that builds even when it remains unexpressed, and an underlying relationship structure that ultimately proves considerably less stable than its careful management initially suggests. It's worth exploring too how this fantasy-sustaining strategy interacts with an avoidant partner's own eventual growth or lack thereof, because the relationship between sustained illusion and genuine change deserves careful, honest examination. An avoidant partner whose fantasy gets successfully and consistently maintained has, in effect, been protected from ever encountering the specific discomfort that typically motivates genuine psychological growth, the productive friction of authentic disagreement, the vulnerability of being truly seen, including one's flaws, the discomfort of navigating another person's genuine, sometimes inconvenient needs. This means the fantasy-sustaining strategy doesn't just fail to build lasting security. It actively works against the avoidant partner's own potential for growth, insulating them from exactly the experiences that might otherwise eventually expand their capacity for genuine intimacy. There's a particular pattern worth naming regarding how this strategy sometimes gets partially unconsciously employed, even by people who haven't deliberately chosen it as a conscious approach, because many of the specific behaviors involved, suppressing genuine reactions to avoid triggering an avoidant partner's withdrawal, minimizing conflict to maintain surface-level peace, softening honest feedback to protect the relationship's fragile stability, emerge gradually and somewhat automatically in response to an avoidant partner's demonstrated sensitivity to genuine closeness, rather than through any explicit strategic decision. Recognizing these behaviors as variants of the same fantasy-sustaining pattern, even when they emerged organically rather than through deliberate strategy, matters considerably for anyone trying to honestly assess whether their own relationship has drifted toward this dynamic without any conscious decision to pursue it. It's worth examining what genuine self-assessment for this pattern actually requires, because recognizing it accurately often proves more difficult than it initially sounds, precisely because the suppression involved happens gradually and can feel, from the inside, like simple accommodation or reasonable compromise, rather than significant self-erasure. Useful questions worth asking honestly include whether specific feelings or needs get regularly suppressed out of concern about how the avoidant partner might respond, whether genuine disagreement happens less frequently than it likely should given the relationship's actual dynamics, and whether there's a persistent, low-grade sense of performing a particular role rather than simply existing authentically within the relationship. Honest answers to these questions often reveal the fantasy-sustaining pattern operating considerably more extensively than initially suspected, even in relationships that don't outwardly resemble the deliberate, strategic version this exploration initially described. There's something worth naming about what actually needs to happen in order to interrupt this pattern once it's been accurately recognized, because simple awareness alone rarely proves sufficient to produce lasting change. Interrupting this pattern typically requires gradually reintroducing authentic self-expression back into the relationship, even when doing so produces discomfort or triggers the avoidant partner's withdrawal response initially. This process tends to feel considerably riskier than continuing the established fantasy-sustaining pattern, precisely because it removes the illusion of control that the fantasy previously provided, replacing it with genuine uncertainty about how the avoidant partner will actually respond to authentic engagement, rather than to the carefully managed version they'd grown accustomed to receiving. It's worth exploring as well what this interruption process typically reveals about a specific relationship's genuine potential, because the avoidant partner's response to this reintroduced authenticity provides considerably more reliable information than anything the fantasy-sustaining period ever could have offered. An avoidant partner capable of tolerating genuine disagreement, genuine need, and genuine imperfection, even if imperfectly and with visible discomfort, demonstrates real potential for the kind of gradual capacity building that genuine intimacy requires. An avoidant partner who responds to this same authenticity with immediate, sustained withdrawal, refusing to tolerate anything beyond the carefully managed fantasy they'd previously received, reveals something equally important: that the relationship's stability depended entirely on the fantasy's continued maintenance, information considerably more valuable, however painful, than continuing the performance indefinitely without ever testing what actually lies beneath it. There's a final consideration worth naming here about how this entire understanding should inform anyone currently weighing whether to attempt this fantasy-sustaining strategy in hopes of finally securing an avoidant partner's continued presence. The security this strategy promises was never actually available through this particular path, regardless of how skillfully it's executed, because security built on illusion remains fundamentally unstable by definition, dependent entirely on the illusion's continued, exhausting maintenance rather than on anything genuinely durable. Real security, if it develops at all with an avoidant partner, comes through an entirely different process, one this exploration has traced throughout: patient exposure to authentic intimacy, honest boundaries, and genuine acceptance that the outcome remains genuinely uncertain, rather than something any specific strategy, however cleverly constructed, can reliably guarantee. It's worth naming too how mutual friends and outside observers typically perceive relationships built around this fantasy-sustaining dynamic, because their perception often diverges considerably from how the relationship feels from inside, offering valuable, if uncomfortable, outside perspective. Friends observing from a reasonable distance sometimes notice the specific quality of performance involved, remarking, whether directly or through subtler cues, that the person maintaining the fantasy seems different around their avoidant partner than they do in other contexts, more careful, more measured, somehow smaller or more contained than their usual self. This external observation, when it happens, deserves careful, honest consideration rather than automatic dismissal, because outside perspective often catches patterns of self-suppression that become increasingly difficult to recognize from inside a relationship where that suppression has become gradually normalized over time. There's a particular consideration worth exploring regarding how this fantasy-sustaining pattern intersects with broader cultural narratives about romantic love, because many popular depictions of romance inadvertently reinforce exactly this kind of self-sacrificing performance as evidence of genuine devotion, rather than recognizing it as a potentially unsustainable pattern deserving careful scrutiny. Stories celebrating a partner's willingness to change themselves entirely, to become whatever version of a person their partner needs, to sacrifice their own preferences and needs in service of making a difficult relationship work, often get framed as romantic ideals rather than as warning signs. Recognizing how these cultural narratives can normalize and even glamorize the fantasy-sustaining pattern being described throughout this exploration matters considerably for anyone trying to evaluate their own relationship honestly, separate from broader cultural messaging that doesn't always distinguish clearly between genuine sacrifice, made from strength and self-erasure, made from fear of abandonment. It's worth examining as well how this pattern sometimes intensifies specifically during periods of relationship instability, because the temptation to lean more heavily into fantasy-sustaining behavior often peaks precisely when a relationship feels most precarious, when an avoidant partner's withdrawal has become more pronounced or more frequent than usual. This timing makes intuitive sense. Greater perceived risk of loss naturally produces greater willingness to sacrifice authentic self-expression in hopes of preventing that loss. But it's worth naming that this intensification, however understandable, tends to accelerate the very costs this exploration has traced throughout, deepening the gap between authentic self and performed self, precisely during the period when genuine, honest communication would actually serve the relationship's stability far more effectively than increased performance ever could. There's something worth naming about how children complicate this entire dynamic when they're part of a longer relationship structure, because parents modeling this fantasy-sustaining pattern within their own romantic relationship risk inadvertently teaching children that authentic self-suppression represents a normal, even admirable component of committed partnership. Children raised in households where one parent has organized their identity and behavior around managing the other parent's comfort often absorb this pattern as a template for their own future relationships, sometimes recognizing and rejecting it only much later in life, if they ever fully recognize it at all. This intergenerational consideration adds significant weight to the broader argument against pursuing this fantasy-sustaining strategy, extending its potential costs well beyond the immediate relationship into patterns that may echo across an entire family's future relational history. It's worth exploring finally what a genuinely healthier alternative actually looks like in practical, concrete terms, because understanding the alternative in specific detail helps clarify why it represents a considerably better path forward, despite offering less immediate certainty than the fantasy-sustaining strategy initially seems to promise. This healthier alternative typically involves clearly communicating genuine needs and boundaries, even when doing so produces discomfort, maintaining consistent, authentic self-expression, rather than adjusting it based on the avoidant partner's momentary comfort, and accepting, with genuine equanimity rather than desperate resistance, that this authenticity might eventually reveal the relationship's actual limitations rather than successfully disguising them indefinitely. This approach requires considerably more courage than the fantasy-sustaining strategy, precisely because it involves relinquishing the illusion of control that strategy provides, but it represents the only approach actually capable of producing genuine, sustainable intimacy, rather than an elaborate, exhausting performance, destined eventually to collapse. There's a particular nuance worth naming about how this healthier alternative doesn't require abandoning patience or compassion for an avoidant partner's genuine struggles with vulnerability, because the distinction being drawn throughout this exploration isn't between harsh confrontation and gentle accommodation. It's between authentic presence, patient and compassionate but still genuinely honest, and performed presence, calibrated specifically to avoid triggering discomfort, regardless of what that calibration costs the person doing it. Genuine patience with an avoidant partner's slow, uneven progress toward greater capacity for intimacy remains entirely compatible with maintaining authentic self-expression throughout that process. What isn't compatible with genuine, sustainable patience is the wholesale suppression of authentic self that the fantasy-sustaining strategy specifically requires in order to function. It's worth considering too how someone recovering from having employed this fantasy-sustaining strategy for an extended period typically needs to approach the process of reconnecting with their own authentic self, because this reconnection rarely happens instantly or without considerable deliberate effort. Years of suppressing genuine reactions in service of maintaining someone else's comfortable illusion often leaves people genuinely uncertain about what their own authentic preferences, needs, and emotional patterns actually are, having spent so long calibrating their behavior around someone else's requirements rather than their own internal experience. This recovery process often benefits considerably from therapy or other structured support, specifically designed to help rebuild this connection to authentic self. Work that matters considerably, not just for any future relationship the person eventually builds, but for their own basic sense of identity and well-being, independent of any relationship at all. What actually produces lasting connection with an avoidant partner, when it happens at all, isn't the successful maintenance of their fantasy, but rather patient, consistent exposure to genuine intimacy, delivered at a pace their nervous system can gradually learn to tolerate, alongside honest boundaries around what kind of relationship remains sustainable if that growth never fully develops. This path offers no guarantee, and it requires accepting genuine uncertainty rather than the illusion of control this fantasy-based strategy seems to promise. But it represents the only path that actually builds toward real, sustainable security, rather than toward an increasingly exhausting performance destined, eventually, to collapse under the weight of whatever reality it was constructed to avoid. There's a final thought worth carrying forward from everything this exploration has traced, one that applies regardless of which specific avoidant partner or fantasy variant prompted the original question of whether this strategy might finally secure lasting security. The advice to play into an avoidance fantasy in hopes they will never leave misunderstands at its foundation what actually makes any relationship worth staying in. A relationship sustained by successful performance isn't actually a relationship two people are choosing to remain in together. It's a relationship one person is working, often exhaustively, to prevent the other from leaving, which is a fundamentally different and considerably less stable arrangement than genuine mutual partnership built on both people's authentic presence and continued, freely offered choice. This distinction matters enormously for understanding why lasting security was never actually available through the fantasy-sustaining path in the first place. Security built on someone else's continuous managed illusion depends entirely on that management never failing, on the performance never cracking, on reality never intruding in ways too significant to disguise. This is an inherently fragile foundation, regardless of how skillfully constructed, because it depends on maintaining something fundamentally false rather than building on something genuinely true. Real security, by contrast, doesn't require this kind of constant, exhausting maintenance, precisely because it's built on something that doesn't need to be hidden or carefully managed in order to remain stable. For anyone currently weighing whether to pursue this fantasy-sustaining strategy, hoping it might finally produce the permanence that honest effort hasn't yet achieved, it's worth considering what kind of relationship is actually being sought in the first place. If the goal is simply preventing someone from leaving, regardless of what that prevention costs in terms of authentic self-expression, this strategy might succeed, at least temporarily, at achieving that narrow, specific goal. But if the goal is genuine partnership, mutual growth, and a relationship built on two people actually choosing each other, rather than one person successfully managing the other's departure, this strategy will never actually deliver what it promises, no matter how perfectly the fantasy gets sustained or for how long. That final distinction between preventing someone's departure and building something they genuinely never want to leave is worth sitting with carefully before investing further energy into any version of this fantasy-sustaining approach. Only one of these two outcomes offers anything resembling lasting peace, and it was never the one built on illusion, however cleverly maintained, however genuinely well-intentioned the underlying effort behind it happened to originally be. What remains true, regardless of how this understanding gets applied, is that genuine love was never meant to require this much exhausting disguise to be sustained, and recognizing that clearly represents quiet, meaningful progress, independent of what any specific avoidant partner chooses to do with it.